There are few fictional characters as instantly recognisable as Sherlock Holmes. Mention his name almost anywhere in the world, and the same image tends to appear: a tall, lean figure in a deerstalker hat, a pipe, a magnifying glass, the address of 221B Baker Street. It is an image so familiar that it can feel as though it has always existed. Yet the Sherlock Holmes we picture today was not created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle alone. It was shaped by illustrators, actors, playwrights, and filmmakers, each adding something to the mythology. Some interpretations have faded with time, others have endured for a generation or two before making way for the next. But few have left a mark as deep as the series of films made between 1939 and 1946, starring Basil Rathbone as Holmes and Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson. There were 14 films in total. Some were lavish Victorian mysteries. Others transported Holmes into the modern world of the Second World War, where he battled spies, saboteurs, and Nazi agents, rather than the criminals of 19th century London. Together they became one of the most influential screen interpretations of Sherlock Holmes ever made. For decades they were the Sherlock Holmes films. They played in cinemas, on televisions, and in repertory screenings. Children discovered them on rainy afternoons, while adults returned to them as reliable favourites. To millions of viewers, Basil Rathbone wasn't simply playing Sherlock Holmes, he was Sherlock Holmes. Today, however, they occupy a curious place in cinema history. Modern audiences are more likely to think of Jeremy Brett's meticulous television detective, Robert Downey Jr.'s action hero, or Benedict Cumberbatch's contemporary reinvention. The Rathbone films remain admired by enthusiasts, but they are no longer the defining cultural force they once were. So how did 14 comparatively modest productions come to dominate the world's imagination for almost half a century? And why did that dominance eventually fade? The answer begins long before Basil Rathbone ever stepped in front of a camera. By the time Hollywood seriously turned its attention to Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle's detective had already become one of the most famous fictional characters ever created. Since first appearing in The Study in Scarlet in 1887, Holmes had escaped the confines of the printed page with remarkable speed. Stage adaptations flourished, touring companies travelled across Britain and America. Silent films appeared almost as soon as cinema itself began telling stories. Audiences wanted mysteries, deduction, and the reassuring certainty that Holmes would always reveal the truth before the final curtain. By the 1930s, Sherlock Holmes had become more than a literary character. He had become a cultural institution. That popularity also presented a problem. Everyone already had their own idea of what Sherlock Holmes should be. Readers knew the stories. Theatre audiences remembered earlier actors. Magazine illustrations by Sidney Paget had fixed Holmes's appearance in the public imagination with the familiar deerstalker, Inverness cape, and sharp, aquiline features. Any actor taking the role inherited decades of expectation. Hollywood had experimented with Holmes before, but no screen version had yet become truly definitive. And then Basil Rathbone arrived. Looking back now, it is difficult to imagine anyone more perfectly suited to the role. Tall, elegant, and possessed of strikingly angular features, Rathbone seemed almost to have stepped directly from Paget's illustrations. His profile alone carried an air of intelligence. His measured voice conveyed authority without effort, while his precision of movement suggested a mind always operating one step ahead of everyone else. Yet appearance was only part of his appeal. Long before becoming Sherlock Holmes, Rathbone had established himself as one of Hollywood's finest character actors. He frequently portrayed aristocrats, military officers, and perhaps most memorably, sophisticated villains. Audiences already associated him with intelligence, confidence, and refinement. Even when playing antagonists, he possessed a dignity that made him fascinating to watch. He also brought unexpected authenticity to Holmes's more physical qualities. Rathbone had been an accomplished fencer for much of his life, a skill that Conan Doyle's detective occasionally displays in the original stories. His movements carried a natural grace that suggested discipline rather than theatricality. Holmes rarely appeared to exert himself, yet always seemed completely in control. When producers cast Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes, they were not simply hiring a leading man. They were finding an actor whose natural qualities aligned almost perfectly with the public's existing image of the detective. Just as important, however, was the man standing beside him. Nigel Bruce's Dr. Watson remains one of the most debated portrayals in the history of Sherlock Holmes. Modern audiences familiar with Conan Doyle's stories often express surprise. Doyle's Watson is intelligent, capable, courageous, and although not Holmes's intellectual equal, an accomplished doctor and military veteran. Bruce's interpretation softens many of those qualities. His Watson is warm-hearted, loyal, and immensely likable, but he is also absent-minded, easily bewildered, and frequently provides comic relief. Critics have spent decades pointing out the differences. Audiences, on the other hand, adored him. Bruce's Watson made Holmes more approachable. Rathbone's detective could sometimes appear almost superhuman in his powers of deduction, but Bruce gave him someone to explain his reasoning to, someone to protect, tease, and occasionally frustrate. Together they formed one of cinema's great partnerships, balancing intellect with humanity in a way that audiences found enormously appealing. It is one of those curious moments where absolute faithfulness to the source material mattered rather less than chemistry. And chemistry was something Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce possessed in abundance. When they appeared together on screen, they seemed completely at ease in one another's company. Holmes's occasional impatience never concealed genuine affection for Watson, while Watson's admiration never descended into simple hero worship. Their friendship felt lived in, comfortable, and entirely believable. It became one of the principal reasons audiences kept returning. The first opportunity to discover whether this partnership truly worked arrived in 1939 with The Hound of the Baskervilles. It was a decision that proved inspired. If there was ever a Sherlock Holmes story destined for the cinema, it was The Hound of the Baskervilles. Published in 1902, it had long been regarded as one of Conan Doyle's finest achievements. The lonely moor, the isolated Baskerville Hall, and the legend of the supernatural hound combined Gothic horror with detective fiction in a way that had captivated readers for decades. It offered mystery, atmosphere, and spectacle in equal measure, qualities that translated naturally to the screen. Released in 1939, the film immediately justified the confidence placed in Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. It looked handsome, moved briskly, and, above all, felt unmistakably like Sherlock Holmes. The fog-shrouded landscapes, candle-lit interiors, and looming shadows created a world that audiences instantly recognised as Victorian England. Even if much of it had been constructed on Hollywood sound stages, Rathbone projected intelligence without arrogance, while Bruce established the warmth and humour that would become central to the series. Critics responded favourably, audiences embraced it, and the film remains one of the most admired Sherlock Holmes adaptations ever made. A second film quickly followed. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, released later the same year, reunited the principal cast and drew more loosely on Conan Doyle's work. Once again, the emphasis fell on elegant production values, memorable villains, and the growing chemistry between Holmes and Watson. At this point, it seemed obvious what the future would hold. More Victorian mysteries, more faithful adaptations, more evenings spent in gaslit London, with Holmes pursuing murderers through foggy streets and country estates. History, however, had other ideas. By the time the second film reached audiences, Europe had entered the Second World War. Within 2 years, the United States would follow. The conflict transformed almost every aspect of popular entertainment, and Hollywood was no exception. Studios increasingly looked for stories that could inform, reassure, and strengthen public morale. Familiar heroes were pressed into new service, and few fictional characters were more familiar than Sherlock Holmes. The rights to the series passed from 20th Century Fox to Universal Pictures. It was a decision that changed everything. Rather than continuing to set Holmes's adventures in the 19th century, Universal made a bold and, at the time, surprisingly logical choice. Sherlock Holmes would simply be brought into the present day. Today, it can feel rather startling. We instinctively think of Holmes as a Victorian figure. Gas lamps, hansom cabs, and the London of Queen Victoria seemed inseparable from his identity. Yet audiences of the early 1940s viewed the change rather differently. Holmes had always represented reason overcoming fear, intelligence defeating evil, and order triumphing over chaos. Those qualities were just as valuable in wartime as they had been in Conan Doyle's original stories. So, beginning with Sherlock Holmes and the Voice of Terror in 1942, Holmes exchanged the comfortable certainty of the 19th century for a world overshadowed by air raids, espionage, and global conflict. The transition could easily have failed. Instead, it worked remarkably well. Part of the reason lies in the flexibility of Conan Doyle's creation. Holmes is not defined by his surroundings as much as by his method. Whether examining footprints on Dartmoor or uncovering enemy spies in wartime London, he remains recognisably the same man. Observation, deduction, and calm intelligence transcend period. Universal understood this. The films retained Baker Street, Dr. Watson, Inspector Lestrade, and many of the familiar supporting elements, while allowing the stories to address contemporary anxieties. Instead of jewel thieves and blackmailers alone, Holmes confronted saboteurs, enemy agents, and criminal conspiracies with national consequences. The result was something rather unusual. Sherlock Holmes became, in effect, Britain's greatest detective and one of cinema's earliest secret agents. Watching these films today, it is easy to see their wartime purpose. Speeches about courage, vigilance, and public duty occasionally reveal their propagandist intentions, while villains often represent threats extending far beyond individual crimes. Yet reducing the films to propaganda alone would be deeply unfair. Many remain wonderfully entertaining mysteries in their own right. Sherlock Holmes faces death, confines an old country house with hidden motives and murder. The Pearl of Death introduces one of the series' most memorable villains in Rondo Hatton's sinister creeper. The Scarlet Claw, often regarded by admirers as the finest of the Universal productions, creates an atmosphere of eerie superstition before revealing Holmes's familiar triumph of logic over fear. Again and again, the films return to the reassuring idea that however impossible a mystery may appear, there is always an explanation waiting to be discovered. And that reassurance mattered even more during wartime. Audiences living through uncertainty found comfort in a detective who could still impose order upon apparent chaos. The films were also changing in more practical ways. Universal generally worked with smaller budgets than Fox had enjoyed. Running times settled at little more than an hour. Sets were reused efficiently and stories became tighter, faster, and more economical. Far from weakening the series, these constraints often became one of its greatest strengths. There is very little wasted movement in the Universal films. A mystery is introduced within minutes. Holmes is immediately engaged. Clues appear rapidly, suspects emerge, danger escalates, and before long the detective gathers everyone together for the inevitable explanation. Modern cinema often mistakes length for importance. These films never do. They understand that a detective story thrives on momentum. Their modest scale also encouraged imagination. Fog drifted through studio streets. The glow of a single lamp in Baker Street or the echoing corridors of an old house often create a stronger atmosphere than lavish spectacle. Universal may have spent less money, but it rarely sacrificed mood. Indeed, atmosphere became one of the defining qualities of the series. It is one reason why audiences continued returning to these films long after the war had ended. They offered not only mysteries to solve, but a world people enjoyed revisiting. And at the centre of that world stood two performers whose partnership had become as important as any individual plot. It is often said that audiences return to characters. In truth, they return to relationships. However ingenious the mysteries became, the enduring success of the Sherlock Holmes films rested on something much simpler. People enjoyed spending time with Holmes and Watson. That may sound obvious, but it is surprisingly difficult to achieve. Detective fiction has produced countless brilliant investigators, yet many remain emotionally distant. Sherlock Holmes has always risked becoming one of them. He is cleverer than everyone around him, notices what others overlook, and rarely allows emotion to cloud his judgment. Such qualities make him fascinating, but they can also make him intimidating. and Watson changes everything. He is our way into Holmes's world. He asks the questions we would ask. He notices the clues we miss. He shares our amazements when Holmes reveals the solution that had been sitting in front of us all along. Nigel Bruce understood this instinctively. His Watson has often been criticised for straying too far from Conan Doyle's original creation, and the criticism is not entirely misplaced. Doyle's Watson is no fool. He is an intelligent physician, a veteran of the Afghan campaign, and on occasion a capable detective in his own right. Bruce's interpretation simplifies many of those qualities in favour of warmth, humour, and gentle exasperation. Literary purists have never entirely forgiven him. Yet audiences rarely seem to mind, because Bruce's performance possesses something that cannot be measured against the printed page: charm. His Watson is loyal without being servile, enthusiastic without becoming irritating, and comic without descending into caricature. He gives Holmes someone to explain his deductions to, but he also gives the audience permission to enjoy them. When Holmes grows impatient, Watson smiles. When danger approaches, Watson follows without hesitation. Beneath the occasional jokes lies genuine courage and unwavering friendship. It is difficult to imagine the series working nearly as well without him. The chemistry between Rathbone and Bruce feels completely natural. They interrupt one another, tease one another, and occasionally irritate one another in ways that suggest years of shared experience. They never appear to be performing a partnership, they simply inhabit one. That sense of familiarity became one of the series' greatest strengths. By the middle of the 1940s, audiences knew exactly what they were going to receive, and that was part of the attraction. A mysterious death, an impossible crime, an anxious client arriving at Baker Street, Holmes quietly observing details everyone else has overlooked, Watson trying to keep pace, Lestrade pursuing the obvious suspect, a dramatic confrontation, then finally the explanation that makes everything seem perfectly logical. There is enormous satisfaction in watching intelligence restore order. Perhaps that is why these films have aged so gracefully. They belong to a style of storytelling that trusts the audience. There are no elaborate twists designed to simply shock. No endless action sequences attempting to disguise weak plotting. The pleasure lies in watching apparently unrelated clues gradually form a coherent picture. Holmes solves problems because he thinks more clearly than anyone else. It is a remarkably simple premise, yet one that remains endlessly appealing. The films themselves also benefit from an economy that modern cinema sometimes forgets. Most run for little more than an hour. In that time, they establish memorable characters, create atmosphere, present a mystery, misdirect the audience, and deliver a satisfying conclusion. There is almost no excess. Every scene pushes the story forward. Every conversation introduces another clue or another suspect. It is filmmaking stripped to its essentials. That efficiency also explains why the films became such dependable favourites on television. An hour was an ideal running time. They fitted comfortably into afternoon schedules, holiday programming, and weekend repeats. Viewers could join them almost anywhere in the story and still become absorbed by the mystery. Long before the phrase comfort viewing entered everyday language, the Rathbone Sherlock Holmes films had quietly become exactly that. For many people growing up during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Sherlock Holmes did not first arrive through the pages of Conan Doyle. He arrived through television on a rainy Saturday afternoon during the school holidays, perhaps after lunch, when the rest of the day stretched invitingly ahead. There was Baker Street, the familiar sitting room with its clutter of papers and chemical experiments, Holmes leaning thoughtfully over a clue, Watson wondering aloud what it all meant, and somewhere beyond the front door, another mystery, waiting to be solved. Repeated often enough, those images become more than entertainment, they become memory. That is one reason why Basil Rathbone's influence became so profound. Generations who never saw the films during their original cinema releases nevertheless came to think of him as the definitive Sherlock Holmes. His clipped delivery, upright posture, and penetrating stare gradually merged with the character himself. Even those who had never consciously watched one of the films absorbed echoes of his performance through cartoons, advertisements, comedy sketches, and later adaptations. His Holmes became the cultural shorthand for Sherlock Holmes. Ironically, that success came at a personal cost. By the end of the series, Rathbone had begun to tire of the role. Like many actors who become strongly identified with a single character, he found that Holmes threatened to overshadow everything else he had accomplished. Despite an impressive career encompassing Shakespeare, historical dramas, adventure films, and memorable villainous performances, audiences increasingly wanted only one thing from him. They wanted Sherlock Holmes. Rathbone continued playing Holmes on radio for several years after the films ended, but he gradually sought opportunities to distance himself from the detective. It is one of the enduring paradoxes of acting. The role that secures an actor's immortality can also become the one from which they most wish to escape. By 1946, after 14 films and countless adventures, the cinematic journey of Basil Rathbone's Sherlock Holmes had to come to an end. The remarkable thing was that its greatest success was only just beginning. Long before home video, streaming services, or box sets, repeated television screenings gave classic films a remarkable second life. They became familiar companions rather than occasional treats. Certain performances ceased to belong solely to the actors who created them and instead became part of popular culture itself. Basil Rathbone's Sherlock Holmes achieved exactly that. For decades, if a newspaper printed a caricature of Sherlock Holmes, it almost invariably borrowed Rathbone's features. If a comedian impersonated Holmes, traces of Rathbone's measured voice and composed manner were rarely far away. Even audiences who had never consciously watched one of the films often recognised the image. He had become the visual language of Sherlock Holmes. Of course, no screen interpretation remains definitive forever. In the 1980s came another remarkable reinvention. Jeremy Brett approached the character from an entirely different direction. His performances sought to return Holmes as closely as possible to Conan Doyle's original stories, restoring many aspects of the detective's personality that earlier adaptations had softened or ignored. The Granada television series was meticulous, beautifully produced, and for many readers, astonishingly faithful to the source material. A new generation embraced its own Sherlock. Later still came fresh interpretations. Each version reflected the tastes of its own era. Each introduced Sherlock Holmes to audiences discovering him for the first time. This is exactly what enduring fictional characters are supposed to do. They evolve. Yet none of those later portrayals appeared in isolation. Whether consciously or unconsciously, every actor stepping into Holmes's shoes has worked in the shadow of those who came before. Some borrowed elements from Rathbone, others deliberately rejected them, but all inherited a screen tradition that he helped establish. That may be the greatest achievement of the series. The films did not merely adapt Sherlock Holmes, they standardized him. They helped establish how cinema presented Holmes, how Watson complimented him, how Baker Street should feel, and even how a detective story should unfold. Their influence reached beyond individual performances, into the grammar of screen storytelling itself. Of course, viewed today, they are not without imperfections. Their wartime propaganda occasionally dates them. Nigel Bruce's Watson remains controversial among readers devoted to Conan Doyle. Studio-bound sets sometimes reveal the limitations of modest budgets. Modern audiences accustomed to faster editing and greater spectacle may find their pace unexpectedly restrained. But none of these observations explain why the films endured for so long. People did not return to them because they were perfect. They returned to them because they were enjoyable. They offered mystery without cynicism, suspense without brutality, intelligence without pretension. Most of all, they offered the reassuring certainty that no puzzle was beyond Holmes's ability to solve. There is something timeless about that promise. Perhaps that is why the films continue to attract new admirers nearly 90 years after Basil Rathbone first donned the deerstalker. Not because they remain the most faithful adaptations, not because they are the most technically ambitious, but because they capture something essential about Sherlock Holmes himself: the pleasure of observation, the satisfaction of deduction, the triumph of reason over confusion. At the beginning of this story, I suggested that the Sherlock Holmes most people picture was shaped as much by cinema as by literature. That is certainly true. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle created Sherlock Holmes, but it was Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce who gave him a face, a voice, and for millions of people around the world, a life beyond the printed page. Their films may no longer dominate popular conversation in the way they once did, yet their influence remains woven into almost every screen detective who followed. Cinema has produced many Sherlock Holmes. Some have been closer to Conan Doyle, some have been more modern, some have been stranger. All have found their audience. But for much of the 20th century, there was only one Sherlock Holmes. And for generations who first met the great detective through flickering cinema screens and rainy afternoons in front of the television, that image has never entirely disappeared. It still waits patiently at 221B Baker Street, violin in hand, pipe resting nearby, ready to solve one more impossible mystery.